On a mission given to me by Woody Shaw, Sunship, Dizzy, and Billy Higgins, dedicated to pursuing a piece of our cultural heritage through interviews with my jazz heroes, this is The Jake Feinberg Show. Welcome, everybody, inside the Blackwood Broadcasting Studios at an undisclosed Institute of Higher Learning. This is The Jake Feinberg Show, and we're happy to have all of you along with us today. Many of the artists I've interviewed have dabbled in other lines of entertainment. Putter Smith was an actor for a second. Pat Britt was a ball player for a minute. Melvin Van Peebles is a playwright and an actor. My guest today is someone who straddled both the cosmic and scientific, the ring modulator and the catatonic, expanding consciousness in sound and the sustainability of the human psyche. The opportunity to practice improvisation and deal with the abstractions of the human mind is not just compelling, it's one of another kind. My guest is steeped in academia and the street club. He is someone who grew up with parents who taught him to understand and then stand out. Individuality is the key to self-cultivation, but it is individualism not of selfish means, but within the group context. Be it with a patient reclining in his Marin sanctuary, or playing off the likes of Buster Williams, Freddie Waits, Jerry Granelli, Mel Graves, George Marsh, or David Grisman. My guest seeks to collaborate with individuals who are equally bestowed in creativity or neurobehavior. A longtime Bay Area pianist and a practicing psychiatrist with a degree from Johns Hopkins University, Dr. Denny Zeitlin. Welcome to the Jake Feinberg Show.
Hey, Jake. Thanks very much for that very gracious introduction, man.
Is it accurate?
Well, I mean, I mean, certainly historically it is. I was extremely lucky to have parents who encouraged me to follow both professions. I think from a very, very early age, I felt pulled in these directions. Had a little head start on music when I was 2 or 3 years old. I have memories of clambering up on the lap of whichever parent was playing the family Steinway and putting my little hands on their hands and going for a ride on the keyboard and getting a kinesthetic feeling for what it was like to traverse that territory before I even was able to play notes on my own. And then later was climbing around on and in the piano, making sounds, banging on strings, taking hammers to them, and they encouraged all this. And then a few years later, when my psychiatrist uncle started talking with me about his patients when I was in 2nd or 3rd grade, I was equally fascinated and pretty soon started practicing psychotherapy without a license on the playground.
Yeah, I was reading.
Kids would come up and want to talk with me, and I was fascinated, and I just had a sense from early on I was going to pursue both these fields, and I was lucky that I had parents that never put it to me as though I had to be either or. They understood I was really drawn to do both of these things in my life, and I'm grateful I've been able to pursue both fields.
It is amazing, really. I mean, I did not, I just, as I've gone through my evolution in my own way, I mean, it's too, like I said before, it's really compelling because you were driven to create. I mean, I look at guys like, Gene Bertoncini, Eric Klaas, Paul Winter, Bill Evans. They loved your inventive songwriting. You were a composer. They loved your song. So you're extremely experimental in a writing capacity, yet you also understand the fallibility of the human mind. And that to me is I don't even know if I can put it in words. It's really pretty compelling.
Well, it's being involved in the two fields have really enriched my life in so many ways, Jake. And I've always felt that the cross-pollination of the two fields has helped each field. Like I'm a better pianist for being a psychiatrist, and I'm a better psychiatrist for being a musician. There's just no question in my mind about that. I mean, one could argue that if I had a more almost monomaniacal focus on one field to the exclusion of the other, I might have, on the one hand, in psychiatry, written books in psychiatry and served on more panels and been on committees and done actual research. But, those things never really called to me that much. And you could argue if I had been a full-time musician, I might have had time to be out on the road 10 months out of the year and travel all over the world incessantly and, write more pieces for symphony orchestra. And that might have been fun, but that really wasn't at the actual heart of what music was about for me. So it's ended up that being able to do both, I think over the years I've carved out what is the heart of each activity for me and what's really crucial. And it's turned out there's been some central commonalities with the two fields that have been very powerful for me. And I think at bedrock, each activity involves the deepest kind of communication, an empathic connection. If I'm in my office and a patient is talking with me about his or her psychological life, my challenge is to be able to enter their world, to almost in a way suspend my own boundaries of myself and enter their psyche and really feel what it's like to have had the experience they're talking about. And in music, if I'm playing with musicians on the stand, it's so important that I'm not only inhabiting my own musical life and impulses and feelings, but getting into theirs so that what emerges feels like a group music. And that involves the same kind of empathy, the same kind of deep communication. And I think that's a commonality that has galvanized my work in both fields.
Talking to Dr. Denny Zeitlin, it's something that I dabbled with for a while as an undergraduate. It's, psychology, and I love the fact that you did not become one of these ivory tower guys, where you were just doing, abstract research committee stuff. You were able to develop a reputation enough early on as a player with chops, and then just getting into the meat and potatoes. I wanted you to talk about when you were at Columbia. How did you meet John Hammond?
Well, it's really by a lucky accident. I mean, I was a junior in medical school at Johns Hopkins in 1963, and I had a fellowship at Columbia University for 10 weeks in New York City in the psychiatry department. So I rented an apartment on the west side, and I had a couple people that I knew there that I just wanted to connect with. I remembered Paul Winter from the days he was living in and around Chicago and being at Northwestern, and I grew up in a suburb of Chicago. And Paul and I had met, and he had heard my playing and had liked it. And so I got together with him. He was then just beginning to record for Columbia with a producer, John Hammond. And I was at his apartment, and we were just hanging out, and said, "Man, you really ought to come and meet my producer and just play for him, man. I mean, I just love your music. I just think it ought to be out there." And I said to Paul, "Look, man, I appreciate it, but I just don't want to get into recording. I've heard too much stories about how record companies take artists and make them play stuff they don't want to play and sort of subvert their whole real artistic groove, and I don't need to do it. I'm going to be a physician. I hope I'll always play music, but the idea of making records and doing all that, it just doesn't feel that central to me." But he persisted and eventually almost dragged me kicking and screaming into John Hammond's office. And Hammond turned out to be this ebullient, incredibly enthusiastic guy. He just asked me, "Why don't you just play something for me?" And so I played a couple tunes, and he said, "I love what you do, and I would love for you to come to Columbia and record, and You can record whatever you want. You can use whomever you want. You can have carte blanche. I really love what you're doing. And I had trouble believing it, but he seemed absolutely sincere. At the time, I was too naive to realize how incredibly gracious and lucky an offer like this would be. And it started my activities in the recording studios and making albums. He suggested that I get my feet wet in recording by being the featured pianist on a young flutist he had just discovered, who he really believed in, Jeremy Steig, who was going to do his debut album with, he had Ben Riley and Ben Tucker. Ben Riley on drums, Ben Tucker on bass. And we got together, and it was just sort of a blowing date. But I thought it was really happening, and the album came out and made a nice kind of splash and created some interest. And then what followed is I did a series of 4 trio albums for Columbia in the period of 1964 to 1967. And Hammond throughout was always encouraging, and he opened a lot of doors for me that otherwise would have remained closed. I mean, I was on The Tonight Show during that period, I think 3 times, and started playing at major festivals like Newport and Monterey. And so there's no question that John Hammond really opened tremendous musical doors for me.
It's just it's funny because you talked about with Paul Winter how perverted or how mangled you thought the production side of music was at that time. So it was already kind of corrupted at that point, even though Hammond was not that way.
No, but I'd heard so many other musicians grumbling about recording and making records and what happened to their music, and they didn't get an honest count, and they didn't get their royalties, and the tunes they thought were going to be in the album weren't, and other ones were put on that they didn't like, and they used outtakes, and they did all that kind of stuff. Really created a vibe that was not inviting to me at that time. So Hammond really provided the antidote to that.
Well, let's take a listen to an early Zeitlin piece of Cathexis, John Hammond produced album. We'll come back and talk about it, okay?
Okie dokie.
Denny, if you could, I've talked to a number of guys who are fascinated by this Lydian concept, and you learned that under George Russell. And if you could, in lay terms, could you explain what that concept is?
Well, it'd be hard to put it into a capsule. I had first heard George Russell's music when I was in college, and I just loved the freshness and the way he embraced pantonality in such an organic sort of way, and that it seemed his writing seemed to be able to combine vertical thinking and horizontal thinking, which is something that I had always been drawn to myself. And when I was on this fellowship at Columbia, where I first met John Hammond, in that same 10-week period, I actually met and hung out with George Russell. And it really wasn't so much that I was a student of his during that time, of his Lydian concept. It ended up more we just hung out together. I played for him, and he would make suggestions and stuff like that. I had developed a kind of intuitive way of improvising and thinking about music that paralleled what he was doing in terms of being able to think and translate from horizontal into vertical forms, horizontal being lines that follow note after note as they move horizontally across time, and vertical refers to 2 or more notes being played at the same time. And they're not mutually exclusive, and I wanted to continue to develop to be able to translate vertical structures into horizontal dimensions and vice versa. And just hanging out with George was tremendously helpful and useful, and his Lydian chromatic concept of tonal organization really helps one develop the ability particularly to think horizontally. I realize that this could literally be a seminar. It would take several classes to, but I know that Gil Evans, George Russell, some of these guys, these brilliant
leaders, they had a completely holistic look at music, and you guys were you learned under them. A lot of people I talked to, they had opportunities to study with, be it, Gil Evans and whatnot, and just, it really opened up their minds, and this vertical and horizontal stuff, you're throwing in mathematics and equations and things like that. But something caught my attention here. I want to read something because I think for younger musicians, this idea of stories, poems, or even images is important in songwriting. And this is something that Dr. Denny Zeitlin wrote about a song on this album called "Little Children Don't Go Near the House." And this is quoting Denny Zeitlin. "Picture two children walking in the woods. They see an old crone, the kind of crone that always seems to be waiting in woods for little kids. She points to a house in the distance and warns them to stay away from it. It is not that there are demons or devils in the house, but rather that the dwelling contains a vast storehouse of all the memories of people who realize too late what they missed while they were young. It is, in sum, a storehouse of disillusionment." That is psychology 101 for me right there. At 34, okay, I was awakened for various reasons in my life. Okay, but I refuse to become part of. I do not want to go to that crone's house, and I'm not going to. And I assume with patients that you see along the way, they're wrapped up in their own issues, but at the core, it is kind of not taking advantage of the gifts that you were given. And I think that the way you summed it up in that allegory, even though we didn't listen to that tune, it lends itself to those themes. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I mean, you've summarized so much of it so well, Jake. I don't know really what more I could say about it, but maybe to expand on it, in terms of compositions, at times there will be a concept or an image like that will serve as the springboard for a new piece of work of mine. Sometimes it'll be an actual experience I've had. I'm thinking of, for many years, my wife and I were mountain bikers, a period of maybe 25 years, and we mountain biked all over the country. And one of the places we loved to go to was Moab, Utah, which has this incredible kind of sandstone called slick rock that you can ride a mountain bike on. And the name is really a misnomer because the rock is like sandpaper, so you have great traction. You can ride on all kinds of trails and stuff. And I once wrote a tune simply called Slick Rock that I recorded that evoked, for me, the whole pageantry of a group of riders amassing themselves before dawn, then beginning to ride with the rising of the light and going through all these trails and getting into trouble and having a crash and recovering. And so it was in some ways quite programmatic. Then there are other kinds of pieces that I write that emerge that really have no specific reference to an image or an idea or a story. It's just pure music. And then I have trouble finding a title for a piece like that. And sometimes I find something that seems apt, it fits, but it's not as though the title spurred the music. So I think that there's all kinds of approaches to composition that are totally valid and useful for people. I mean, I've never really gotten into this much, but I know a lot of people who have found poetry a tremendous springboard into composition, and they might do a whole series of pieces based on a collection of poems of somebody's. So I think anything that a composer or an improviser can use that helps you tap into that creative spark is wonderful and should be embraced.
You know, and just to continue to layer on that, from a psychotherapy point of view, how do you reckon with people that really are in this they went to the crone's house? I mean, how do you get them to, in even incremental ways? I mean, not everybody has the chops to play music or write poetry or do a radio show or a podcast or do this kind of stuff. But, you know, how do you use that sort of, that allegory in the sense that, because there are so many people that are searching, and it's very normal. I mean, everybody does it, but in psychotherapy, how do you use that, and what kinds of strategies do you use with your patients to kind of get them to not be so despondent about time passing?
Well, it's a good question. Maybe I could approach it by talking about some things that I think are at the bedrock of good psychotherapy and working with patients. I think you need to have a working alliance with a patient that's in your office, which is a sense that you are collaborators. You are on the same journey trying to help that person resolve whatever issues and obstacles are in their way. And these obstacles can be conceptualized as a set of beliefs that are often unconscious, to some degrees may be conscious, but they're beliefs that tell a person how the world works. And these beliefs can be at times very positive, but for people who have psychological difficulties, there's a bevy of beliefs that are negative, that actually cause pathology, and they can be called pathogenic beliefs because they lead to trouble, they lead to pathology. And I think a big part of the job of psychotherapy is to help people resolve and change these pathogenic beliefs. And one of the beliefs that a person might have to do with a feeling of that their life is doomed, that what they went through was so painful and so awful that nothing could ever be done to change it. Mm-hmm. Maybe they grew up in a family where people felt very helpless to change the course of their own lives, and they're identifying with the helplessness of siblings or parents. And so they see their life as a disaster that can never be changed. But over the course of therapy, hopefully, as they tune into this belief system that they're carrying around and are able to remember with real feeling what it was like to be in that family and how, perhaps out of a kind of perverse family loyalty, they have adopted this helplessness that they grew up with, then they could begin to recapture aspects of their past that actually were quite positive. And they could begin to rewrite their history based on new knowledge and new insights, and to be able to recapture some of the precious opportunities they had, and to realize they were terribly important, and now, as an adult, to begin to actualize things that had been put on the shelf for many, many years. And in doing psychotherapy with people, that's one of the most gratifying aspects of being a psychotherapist and being a psychiatrist, is to be part of what enables people to undo these beliefs and begin to live fuller and richer lives.
Well, part of my psychotherapy involves talking to cats like yourself, because it really, growing up in contemporary society in the Western world today, I feel that we psych ourselves out even more, and to be able to come back and to stay grounded with those who came before, those who took advantage of their opportunities. I mean, there's a carpe diem kind of philosophy, and again, when you're dealing with pathological stuff, you're right, it's very different, but in some ways it's breaking those patterns. And I wanted to play a tune for you. It's a lot of I should also mention that part of my psychotherapy is also listening to the music, which is very influential. So let's take a listen to this piece, and we'll come back and talk about it.
Okie dokie.
So that is hypnotic Denny Zeitlin on an album that called Expansion with George Marsh and Mel Graves. The name of that song is A Scarf in the Air. And Denny, take me back to your. I mean, I'm looking here. You play acoustic and electric piano, clavinet, organ, melodica, arp synth, miscellaneous electronics, African thumb piano, and tambourine. What a gas, man! Unbelievable.
That was quite an adventure. I mean, it's very nostalgic for me to hear that tune. I haven't heard that tune in so many years, but it recalls this whole period after I had made this series of albums for Columbia in like between 63, 67, 68. I was getting an increased hunger to expand the tonal range of the acoustic piano. I was getting restless with what seemed like limitations of this instrument, as beautiful as it was. I wanted to be able to sustain notes and bend notes like other musicians, different instruments could, and I was fascinated at the burgeoning world of electronics. And so I really withdrew from public performance for several years to try to get my arms around this other world and getting engineers to build sound modules for me. And this was a long time before you could walk into your corner music store and walk out with a synthesizer under your arm. This was back in the modular days of Moog synthesizers and plugging things in, and it was a while before even something like the ARP Odyssey synthesizer, which I used on this recording, came along. And so it was a period of research and development and trying to find people to play with who shared my desire to try to integrate jazz and classical music, rock, electronics, and free form all into one hopefully unified whole. And I was so lucky to bump into George Marsh and Mel Graves. I mean, George Marsh is a fantastic drummer and percussionist, and Mel, recently deceased, but a fantastic bass player, both on the acoustic and on the electric, and great musicians and fearless improvisers. So we had such a marvelous adventure together, spanning almost 10 years. From, say, 68 to 78 was the period I was really immersed in this multiple keyboard genre-bending sort of venture. And Expansion was the first album that came out from it, and then there was another album called Syzygy, both eventually on the 1750 Arch label. And
you don't worry about that. We're going to get there. I really want to go back to this. It was a question I was fascinated with because you kind of you talked about it. You wanted to get into electronic instrumentation. You know, your interest was waning to it, if that's the right word, from the acoustic. And how you write here in a kind of, you say, I've always had extraordinary luck in finding great musicians to play with. So luck. So you bumped into them, or what kind of music were you going to see live at that time that was sort of influencing you in your own creativity?
Well, the luck part was Mel Graves was living in the Midwest, and he'd heard my albums on Columbia and decided he wanted to come out to the West Coast and see if I could be convinced to have him play with me.
That's great.
And he just came and called me up, and he sounded bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and I figured, what the hell is what I could risk a few minutes to meet this cat and see if he could play, and he sounded wonderful. And I'm trying to remember how I bumped into George Marsh.
Well, they were all playing with Jerry Hahn. So I'm thinking.
No, this was well before that.
Well before that, all right.
Oh yeah.
Well, I was curious because I know George is a fellow he's a Illinois cat, and
he grew up in and around Chicago, and I think he'd heard my albums, and I can't remember specifically how we first met, but we had instant chemistry, and George and I are still close friends, and are getting ready to collaborate on a DVD project with multiple keyboards and all of his percussion and drums and stuff, which I think is going to be a lot of fun.
Oh, I'll tell you, I for the audience, I played a rather lengthy Mel Graves solo, fashioning him on upright bass with Bo as well. Mel's soul is, and he has, rest his soul, he's passed, but, he fought his own demons, but he was right at the core of the experimental fusing of jazz, rock, and classical music. And did he ever say to you in that original conversation, Denny, I think we can do stuff like this based on the albums? Or it was just sort of like, I heard because, a lot of the Columbia stuff is, what you might call, post-bop, acoustic jazz. But this, was it just sort of a totally organic thing, or was that stuff sort of, did he see the potential there?
I think he saw the potential, when he came out, and then I told him what I wanted to do, and that it would involve him actually getting an electric bass and learning how to do that too, and he was open to it, and he got right into it, and very soon had his own voice on the electric as well, and he brought a lot to the table.
What I'm stunned also is about, and again, Arch Records, Bob Shoemaker, who I'm planning on getting it as soon as possible. I know he's a neighbor of yours. There's a picture here. I am amazed of the amount of instruments, and then the three of you, how close in proximity you guys are. Mm-hmm. And I want you to talk. One of the theses of my show, I talked about it with Cosby. I've talked about it with a lot of the guys, especially going to see music live as a musician, just as a part of the audience. How, for you guys are like right locked into each other. How important is it for you to play in small venues, and what has happened to music because of these sort of, the idea of these big rock palaces, these large auditoriums that sort of, you lose that intimacy. Can you talk about that from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly something exciting about playing to 20,000 people, just the fact of that opportunity. But it tends to be, at least for me, a very faceless undertaking. I mean, you look out into blackness, typically don't even see people. They're there, and if it's a big, busy jazz festival, there may be a kind of background hum of people talking even as you're playing. So to me, it's pretty devoid of intimacy. But you get into a club that has decent acoustics and a really good piano and, musicians that you believe in and that you're playing with, and people that come to the club who are willing to reach out and meet the music halfway. Well, that's where I think some musical magic is more likely to happen. It allows to really tap into the nuances of what the instruments are doing. You can hear everything, hopefully, perfectly, and you don't hear a lot of noise of people talking. If you're in a club that really cares about the music, the bartenders aren't wearing blenders during a ballad, and they're not the clink of glasses. So that there's a sense of everybody having this intimate musical adventure together. That's really quite precious to me. I'd much rather play in that setting than to play on a huge stage for thousands of people, some of whom may be listening, some of whom came because they thought it was a hip thing to do. It has a very different vibe.
I don't think I could ask anybody who could answer this question better, but in those live settings in the early 70s, can you talk about some of the clubs that catered towards this type of music? And then, what is the propensity of clubs and how they've shrank so much, and how that maybe has impacted spontaneous improvisational music?
Well, the period of the 70s was this period where I was doing this multiple keyboard stuff, and logistically it involved quite a bit. I mean, I had a roadie who would come. It would take 3 hours to tear down the stuff from my studio and get it to the venue. Then it would take 3 hours to set up at the venue. And then, as you can imagine, after the gig is over, another 6 hours devoted to undoing what had been done.
Right.
So it's labor intensive. And then you also had to be concerned about a place that at least had room to get this multiple keyboard rig in there at right angles to the piano, and then still room for a set of drums and room for Mel's acoustic bass and an electric bass. And later on, when Mel went on to some other things, I had Ratso Harris on bass, a wonderful bassist who's now in New York playing. And it's the same issue. Is like, is there going to be room for us, and can we hear each other? And also, is it a place that's willing to put up with, at that time, was extremely far-out experimental music that was not to everybody's taste. But fortunately, in that time period, there were some venues in and around San Francisco, in the sort of what we call the Greater Bay Area, that were willing to take a chance on us. And we had built up over time, some kind of a following, so that people would come. And I'm not saying we had hundreds and hundreds of people coming to these events, but at least it wasn't usually a venue with just a bunch of empty seats.
No, but you're getting me really fired up. So, did you play at the Keystone Corner, Jackson?
Yeah, we played at. There was a club in San Francisco called the Both And, where we did this multiple keyboard thing. There was a club called the Matrix that was a kind of an avant-garde, mostly rock and roll oriented place, but we played there. The Great American Music Hall was another place that we played several times that we liked, and we played at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music. We played concerts at local colleges. And sometimes up in Sonoma, up in Mendocino County, we would take the truck with all the gear and go on up there and play a gig in some funny little bar in the middle of nowhere. I mean, there was one night we had this gig. I guess it was way up in the Mendocino County, some bar that wanted us to come and play. Mm-hmm. We got there, and it turned out they had not done one stitch of advertising. So we set up the rig, and it turned out 2 people were in the club, and we played our ass off for them. Oh. We had a great time.
Yeah, my spirit was there too. Even though that's did you guys ever have people? Did you ever get soundboard recordings or audience recordings of the live shows you guys did?
I didn't. I never heard of any. I mean, if they were made, they never reached my ears.
And one more thing, just to put a button on this. You speak of the Matrix, and in and around 1970, 71. A couple of guys were running that club, and they had a 2-track and a 4-track recorder. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, I talked to George very much, and he would talk about the idea that him and Mel would play with Merle Saunders, and then they might play with Jerry Garcia and then Jerry Hahn. And I'm curious as to, I interviewed Howard Wales, who was also kind of led those jam sessions, but I need to know what Dr. Denny Zeitlin was involved with those jam sessions.
Well, I remember one that was really a lot of fun. It involved Mel Graves and George Marsh and myself and Jerry Hahn at the Matrix. And that was I thought a great night. I wish it had been recorded. That there was some very, very interesting stuff that came down. I remember that one of the local jazz critics was there that night and just raved about it in the San Francisco Chronicle. So I mean, it was a very.
Was it Ralph Gleason?
John Wasserman.
That's back when newspapers were the mediums for people to. I mean, that to me is just classic. That is the ultimate of individuality. Jerry Hahn Brotherhood with Denny Zeitlin. I mean, give me an analog tape of that, and we'll get that out. And we need to get that tape somewhere. Those are they're laying around. But really, I didn't even know this stuff existed. I should also point out your wife, Josephine, I believe, took the photographs on the back of this album. So thank you very much to her for that. She took some good stuff. You also talk about this idea of you felt the time was right for the album, but uncomfortable with the pressures on artists in the commercial marketplace. Had any commercial labels at that time approached you, and you decided you wanted to go to Arch?
No, they hadn't approached me. I had approached a couple labels, but they like what I heard from John Hammond was, look, this is fascinating music, but we don't have any established conduit for something like this, and we just have to take a pass on it.
The established conduit. Well, you've done a pretty good job letting the cat out of the bag. We got another piece of music here. Let's settle in, take a listen to it. We'll come back and talk about it.
Okay.
Child's play to some, but not to all. Unbelievable, and again, there we go, the voice of Tom Buckner.
Yeah, that was just great having Tom on that. He's up to that point. What he had really been involved in was avant-garde vocalizing as a tenor vocalist, and had done very, very little stuff that really involved jazz or fusion kind of genre, and boy, he just went in there and just floated on that stuff very nicely, I thought.
Again, I look at it and I say the opportunity exists. You could see over time the shrinking of the industry, or the ability for the commerce of records that doesn't really exist today, in the sense that you could look on the back, you see guys like Rich Fidoli, Ratso Harris, yourself, Marsh. You are established at this point big name recognition. But if talking to younger musicians out there, how do you approach the marketing aspect of their sound and their bands, considering that the record industry is somewhat obsolete?
Boy, that's another huge topic, isn't it, Jake? I mean, it's for someone just starting out now, wanting to make a career from performing and recording, it's a very daunting task. And there are so few labels out there that do anything to really promote or distribute. So many of them these days, for instance, years ago there would be the phenomenon of an artist being given an advance on an album. And
right.
that they would come in and the studio would pay for recording the session. They would pay the musicians at least scale for their time, and the leader would get some kind of advance against royalties, and then hopefully the company would promote the album, and there would be some ads and a lot of effort into getting good reviews, and there might even be a trickle of royalties that would come the artist's way. But as you have indicated, that's pretty much dead now. Record labels that do exist rarely, if ever, give any advances now. The artist is expected to deliver a finished master, and then to varying degrees, the record label will fabricate, distribute, and promote the album. But for someone who doesn't have any track record or kind of fan base built up, to get to the point where you could interest a record label in taking you on is problematic. So it ends up more and more artists these days are producing themselves, distributing themselves, promoting themselves, using the internet, maybe making a CD and selling it on CD Baby or Amazon, more and more selling digital downloads from their websites or from other kind of jazz-oriented websites, attempting to do videos and get them on YouTube so that at least people begin to see and hear them in action. It's a whole new game, and with the nature of the economy as it is, and if anything, public interest in jazz dwindling rather than increasing, it's harder and harder to find venues that support jazz players. It's harder and harder to find jazz festivals that haven't become a hybrid in order to sell seats, where that the bulk of what's going on are kind of pop artists with some degree of crossover, but really they're hoping that these pop artists will bring the people into the festival. And it's changed markedly from what the scene was like in the 50s and 60s.
I just, being that, I sort of met your amateur psychologist to a degree, and I wonder if you see, I don't know if dumbing down is the appropriate word, but I look at our society now, especially younger people coming up, this idea that, the basic question is, are we becoming more desensitized as a society? I don't say it because of the mass murders. I don't say it, but I look at the youth. I look at the sort of mass marketing of music and how limited it appears on the surface and the ability to dig underneath. And I realize that, you'd have to be a pretty heady music guy to dig through and find Denny Zeitlin records on Columbia and these kinds of records as well. But that opportunity for searching, the ability to offer an advance in order to take some pressure off the artist to alleviate for them to make creative music, all of a sudden this passive-aggressive way of saying, well, the arts aren't really important. In fact, I heard some politician yesterday talk about, parents should be aware that if someone is going after a philosophy degree or a history degree, what are the expectations in the job market? And it is so... I just call it we're transforming our society into droids.
Yep.
And I want to get your talk because you're in the heat of it every day.
Well, I tell you, I share your concern about it, and this issue of the progressive dumbing down of our culture. I mean, fewer and fewer people even read books anymore. the people's attention span to actually listen to an entire CD is dwindling. More and more people want sound bites. They want experiential bites of things. The phenomenon of texting is it's the ultimate distillation of that at its worst, it seems to me, where one or two words suffice for a series of interchanges between people. And although you can argue that Twitter has increased a global appreciation for events and brings people into a global village, perhaps as nothing before in such a dramatic way, I'm concerned about, again, this distillation into just a few characters of experience. What's going to happen over time to the art of real conversation?
Mm-hmm.
What's going to happen to people being able to sit in each other's presence and have some silence, and then have some talk, and then have some sense of real interchange? And I'm really concerned, certainly in a selfish way, in terms of music, that it seems that more and more people just want to have a sensory blast that just takes them away passively. There's less and less willingness as a culture to reach out and put energy into having an experience in music that would require some energy. People seem, as a group, reluctant to do this. Fortunately, there's a small slice of our culture that still is willing to do that, and those are the people that still support creative music and musicians who are trying to push the envelope into something new, to be able to say something personal, and hopefully have at least a few people willing to reach out and receive it.
Yeah, and I what I don't like is the marginalization of very introspective fields. This idea that success, I was reading this Ralph Emerson poem to a class the other day about success. Mm-hmm. And, one of the lines was to gain the respect of intelligent people, or to make a one life breathe easier as long as you're on the earth. And it's not this insatiable sort of hyper-capitalistic mentality of data, numbers, all this stuff. And it's like, how are you going to expand the mind? That's the point. And expansions with Denny Zeitlin. Before we wrap this up, Denny, I wanted to just, talk a little bit about, you talked about this collaboration with Marsh. What else? You got gigs coming up with Buster Williams in the Bay Area? What's going on? Well,
maybe just to say a few things, if I may, since our interview today has focused on the earliest period of my musical life.
Of course.
To just say a few things, and maybe also invite your listeners, if they're interested, to get a sense of a broader panoply of what I've been about over this, I guess, coming up on 50 years of being a professional musician and 45 years of recording, to visit my website, which is dennyzeitlin.com. There's clips from all of my albums and a lot of videos and stuff, and if they're interested in elaborating on what we've focused on, I would love to have them visit, and there's a place where they could sign up to be on the mailing list, and I'd be happy to keep them apprised of things that are happening now. Most recently, in the last maybe 4 or 5 years, I've been recording for Sunnyside Records, and I've been very, very pleased with them. They really care about the music, and they really do what they can to get the music out there. They've given me complete control philosophically and musically over what I'm doing, and they do a really excellent job. And I guess you mentioned Buster Williams and Matt Wilson are the two guys that I've been playing with in this last decade or so in a trio, and I just love playing with them. Buster, I think, is one of the all-time great bassists, and he's got radar ears, and we're very simpatico harmonically, and Matt Wilson just approaches everything with just a totally fresh way on the drums, and he's just a complete drummer. It's no surprise that he's the hottest drummer in jazz right now. Everybody wants him on their gigs and on their albums, and so I'm fortunate when I can get both of those guys together in time and find a place for us to play, and it's been just a great adventure. We've done a couple of albums together. one for Max Jazz called Slick Rock, and one for Sunnyside, which is just called Denny Zeitlin Trio Live. And since then, I've done several solo piano albums that I've been very pleased with for Sunnyside. And what's coming out in July, we're talking now in February of 2013. In July, Sunnyside is going to release an album called Both And, which is an extension of all of this electroacoustic material we've been talking about in the interview that occurred back in 68 to 78. And it now takes it into the 21st century with the advent of really bold new technology that's happened in the electronics area. So I'm very excited about this album. The subtitle is Solo Electroacoustic Adventures, and that's coming out in July. And also, we talked about my very first recording, which was for Columbia, being the featured pianist with Jeremy Steig on his album Flute Fever. Mm-hmm. That came out as an LP in 1963, and for some reason never got released, reissued as a CD. And I'm told, even as we speak, International Phonograph is bringing that out on CD. So I'm eager to hear it, and I'm hoping people will enjoy it. I still think very fondly back to that first immersion in recording at Columbia's 30th Street studio in New York. It was a very, very special weekend for me.
Yeah, no, I get to read William Steig books to my daughters at night, Sylvester and the Magic Pebble. And
yeah, he was a great cartoonist, and Jeremy's a great artist. Also, he did the cover to the album, and it was a terrific drawing. He was a very, very talented guy.
One question: when you talk about these sophisticated electronics of the 21st century, are you yourself? Are you actually applying those yourself, or is it just through a computer?
No, I'm not a computer programmer. What I'm really availing myself of is the incredible advances in software synthesizers. So these are synthesizers no longer that live in black boxes the way they did back in the 60s and 70s. Now they live in computers, and they have exponentially more power and range than the synthesizers back in the old days had. It's really incredible what's possible now to do in real time. I've always sort of had the fantasy of being an orchestra, and now in my studio downstairs with my rig of 5 keyboards all set up, it's possible to really have a sensation of being some sort of a galactic orchestra. It's very exciting for me.
Dr. Denny Zeitlin, I hope one day we get a chance to shake hands and meet, grab a cup of coffee. It's been
my pleasure, Jake.
Really, it's been an honor to talk to you, man. Keep swinging, and we'll be in touch.
Hey, thanks for having me on, man.
Talk to you soon.
Take care.